vulnerability is something, if you open an application, the application is going to get crashed, and it will also send your data to the attacker. So in that case, it is called as vulnerability. So that is the difference between bug and vulnerability. A bug is an unintended process, whereas vulnerability is intentionally leveraged by the attacker. So that's what the difference between bug and vulnerability is. So CV is an identifier assigned for each vulnerabilities that is being discovered every day. And the NVD is something called National Vulnerability Database, which maintains the record of all these vulnerabilities. So daily we might have hundreds of CVs, hundreds of new vulnerabilities being discovered by security researchers. So for that purpose, we have to maintain the record of all the vulnerabilities that are being discovered. So for that specific purpose, we have something called NVD, which is National Vulnerability Database, where we'll be maintaining all the details regarding the vulnerability. And we have a 0 day. For example, a 0 day is something called an unpatched vulnerability. Let's say, yeah, let's take WhatsApp as an example. So if a security researcher, for example, let's consider myself, if I find a security flaw in WhatsApp, which could allow me to control anyone who's using WhatsApp, so that's a vulnerability. And instead of reporting it to the WhatsApp, that is, WhatsApp is being owned by Facebook, so I have to technically report to Facebook team. So instead of reporting to the Facebook team, if I go on exploiting those flaw, okay, because at this time when I'm exploiting, there is no patch in this world, there is no patch for the vulnerability which I've discovered. So those times it is called as 0 day. So for a vulnerability where no patch exists is called as 0 day. And next we have a patch. For example, if I find a security flaw in WhatsApp and if I report it to the Facebook security team, they'll release a patch. A patch is something that rectifies the vulnerability. So that's what patch and 0 day is. A 0 day is a vulnerability which has no patch. So every upcoming malwares and ransomware will use several 0 days to get into the computer and to get spreaded over the network and to take control of the entire network. Those ransomwares and malwares will take use of this 0 days to get access to the network. So 0 days can't even be identified by antivirus companies, because if a vulnerability is known, only then the antivirus companies can prevent those attacks. So for example, if there is a malware, there are several ways to identify malware. One is signature based detection and one is behavior based detection. And there are several other metrics, but most standard ways to identify a malware is signature based and behavior based. So what antivirus companies will do is like the basic antivirus like Avast, Avast, yeah. Avast and those kind of free antivirus will use mostly signature based detection to let's say if a file is getting into your system, what it will do is it will get the signature of the particular file. By signature I mean the hash. So the hash is unique for each and every file that gets into your system. So it will generate a hash for each file in your system, and it will compare it in the cloud of Avast, where it will have all the signatures from other infected computers. So it will match whether the hash value is getting matched with any other virus infected files. So if it gets matched, then it will point out that particular file as malware. So that's how most of the antivirus work today. So it can't be antiviruses can't help when it comes to 0 days and stuff. And finally, we have a malware. So malware is a huge classification. Inside malware only, we have several subdomains like Trojan horses and botnets and ransomwares. Everything comes under malware. Malware is a generic term, and we have every every software that is not that is used for malicious purposes will come under malware. And we have bug bounty. Okay, so bug bounty is something like it in industrial terms, it's called as a responsible disclosure program. So what bug bounty is basically, MNCs like Google, Microsoft, and so much of companies, in order to make their companies stay secure, they already have an internal security team, and they will conduct a security audit 6 months once or 2 months once. But even though having one of the most skilled professionals in the world in their company, Google and Facebook and every other top-notch companies will conduct something called responsible disclosure program. So in this responsible disclosure program, what will happen is they'll invite hackers all over the world, and they will ask them to test their application for security issues. So all you have to do is you have to register in some crowdsource platform like HackerOne or Bugcrowd. These are most two famous platforms. So all you have to do is you have to register in these platforms as a security researcher, and you can see a lot of responsible disclosure programs coming from even Tesla, Reliance, every top-notch companies, you name it, they will have a responsible disclosure program. So in those responsible disclosure program, all you have to do is they will have a guideline. For example, if Google is conducting a responsible disclosure program, they will have a researcher guidelines where they will be mentioning what are all the websites that come in this responsible disclosure program. For example, if Google is conducting a responsible disclosure program, Google owns so much of domains. For example, they have YouTube, Gmail, and Google Docs, pretty much Google Cloud, everything. So they own a range of domains, and in this responsible disclosure program, they will specify what are all the domains that will come under responsible disclosure program, and you as a researcher will have to only research those domains that are listed in the responsible disclosure program. For example, if Google is conducting a responsible disclosure program and they have mentioned only google.com in the researcher guidelines, then you as a researcher will only have to perform security test in google.com, and you cannot perform on other platforms like youtube.com or slides.google.com or other subdomains. So you have to perform security test on only the allowed domains. So that's what a bug bounty program is. And so once you test for security flaws, as I've already said, OWASP also has security testing methodologies. You can just Google OWASP top 10 security testing methodologies, and you will find ways to test a application for security flaws. So if you find any such security flaws in Google, or I'm just saying Google, for example, almost every company, even in India, so much of companies have a responsible disclosure program. So once you find such flaws and report it to them, they will patch the flaw. They'll patch the flaw and they'll award you either with monetary rewards, like it could be ranging based upon the severity. For example, you have found a security flaw that can compromise the entire server. That is considered as P1 severity. Like the severity of bugs are classified from P4 to P1. P4 is the least severity and P1 is the most severity. So if you report security vulnerabilities that has low impact, like there are several other low vulnerabilities, but I'll be speaking about it later. But for the context, I'll tell you what will happen. So if you're reporting a low severity vulnerability, which will come under P4, they will either give you some T-shirts, or they'll give you monetary refunds, like monetary rewards, like $100 or $200. And like as the severity increases, your reward will increase. For example, if you find a vulnerability that can compromise the entire server, then it will be considered as a P1 vulnerability, which is high severity vulnerability, and it will be paid like for Apple, the maximum bug bounty that has been paid till now is $100K, I guess, for a single bug, for a single vulnerability. They have paid $100,000, and that is the highest vulnerability, highest bounty I have ever heard. So yeah, depending upon the severity of the vulnerability you find, you'll get paid. And we have something called shell. So a shell is a command line interface where you can execute commands. So like in movies, you might have come across several movies where hacking scenes are involved. Like in movies, they'll show some GUI application running, matrix falling, and you will be typing in keyboard and pressing enter, and the hacker will get in. But it's not like that. In real world scenario, it's completely different. You'll have a command line interface, just command line interface. For example, you can take your Windows shell, that is Windows command prompt, or Windows has also PowerShell. When it comes to Linux, you have terminal. So these are all pretty good examples of what a shell is. A shell is a place where you can execute commands. It is an interpreter, so you can execute commands over there. So that is what a shell is. Mostly when you hack an application, when you hack into a target system, or it could be an organization, you will get something called reverse shell. So a reverse shell is an interpreter where you can execute commands. So you can execute commands from your system, and the commands will be executed in the target system, and the output will be displayed in your system. So that's what a reverse shell is. You won't have any GUI applications. You won't have something like a window where you can enter the IP address and hit enter, and the application will and the target will get hacked. No, it's not like that. You have a completely a command shell where you will run commands. So that's pretty much about the basic terminologies. And yeah, penetration testing is nothing but the industrial term of ethical hacking. In penetration testing, a penetration test includes three types, that is white box, black box, and gray box. Like I said, penetration, don't confuse penetration testing and ethical hacking. Ethical hacking is what to say, it's a kind of it's a context, whereas penetration testing is performed in companies. In let's say you are performing a security testing in company, it will not be termed as ethical hacking. In industrial terms, it's called as penetration testing. And penetration testing is broadly classified into three types. There are white box, black box, and gray box. So in white box, what they'll be doing is, let's say you are performing a penetration test for a company. That is, a company is, you as a hacker, you're a hacker now, and if a company is approaching you and they are asking you to test their application or test their organization for security flaws. So what you will do is, there are three types. One is white box. In the scenario of white box, what will happen is, the company will give you all the details, like what are all the, how many computers are running in that particular organization, how many individuals are there, what is the OS that they are primarily using, what are the applications that they primarily use, and every other information. All these information will be provided by the company itself. So during those times, it's called as white box. And we have something called black box. In black box, what will happen is, same, the company will approach you and they'll ask you to perform a security testing on their company or on the applications they use. But this time they won't give any information. So they'll want you to think like a hacker and get into the system. So what they'll do is, they'll give no information about their company. All you have is a company name and their address. You can do whatever you want. You can snoop in like a hacker, you can snoop in like a plumber, and you can place malwares into the system. You can throw away pen drives and you can place malwares in the pen drives. So black box testing is fun. And finally, we have a gray box testing, which is a blend of both this white box and black box, where some basic informations are provided, like let's say the OS they use, or the individuals and their positions who are currently working in the company. So very basic information are given, and you have to perform some information gathering. So that's what called as gray box. And yeah, getting into the phases of ethical hacking or penetration testing, whatever, we have 5 phases. So basically, in ethical hacking, what you are going to do is, you're going to target a computer or a device. It can be an IoT device, or it can be an organization, or it can be a mobile platform. It could be anything. So basically, you will have a target, and in order to hack into the target, so that's what called as hacking. Whereas ethical hacking is, you will be hacking into the target with the permission from the owner of the device. That is what called as ethical hacking. That's the main difference between hacking and ethical hacking. Is, in hacking, you'll be hacking into the target without the knowledge of the owner, whereas in ethical hacking, you will be hacking into the device with the knowledge of the owner. Sorry, wait a second. Yeah, so that's the difference between hacking and ethical hacking. So in both these cases, well, yeah, hacking is illegal and ethical hacking is legal. In ethical hacking, you get the permission from the owner. You will sign something called the NDA, which is non-disclosure agreement, and you will perform all the legal procedures before commencing the ethical hacking. So it's completely legal. Whereas hacking, that is unethical hacking, is completely illegal, and you will get a jail term for hacking into, if you get caught. So that's what the difference between hacking and ethical hacking is. And for both these, that is the only difference between hacking and ethical hacking. Other than that, all the phases we follow are same. So we have something called reconnaissance, scanning, exploitation, privilege escalation, and finally we have reporting. So I'll explain one by one. So in reconnaissance, we have two types of reconnaissance. One is active reconnaissance and passive reconnaissance. So what reconnaissance means is, well, we are going to hack into a target, right? So in order to hack into a target, we must know a lot of information. For example, like I said, whether first of all the host is, that is our target, is alive or not. We have to know that. And if the target is alive, what kind of security measures that the organization is, or the target is using, what kind of ports are open in order to establish the communication. I hope you know what ports is. I can't get into the network essentials. I hope you know the network prerequisites. So yeah, you'll be performing port scans to identify what are all the open ports in a particular target, and you'll get the services that are running on particular ports. For example, if it is a if the target is running an SSH port open, you'll be enumerating the services that is being run on that particular open SSH port, whether it's open SSH or any other service. So that's what you will do in reconnaissance. You will gather as much as information possible in reconnaissance. And there are two types of reconnaissance. One is active reconnaissance and passive reconnaissance. So what active reconnaissance is, in active reconnaissance, you'll be establishing the contact. For example, in order to know that the host is alive or not, there are two types. One, you can perform active reconnaissance. That is, you can directly just ping the host. You can just ping, you can open your command prompt and type ping and space IP address. So what will happen is a packet will be sent from your computer to the target computer. And if the target computer is alive, if the target host is alive, you'll get a reply back. So in this case, you are making a direct contact with the target. So that it is called active reconnaissance. You can also determine if the host is alive by passive reconnaissance. So passive reconnaissance is something where you won't be making direct contact. For example, there are several other online tools you can use. For example, there is Whois, there is several ping tools available online. All you have to do is type ping online, and you have to enter the IP address, and that specific tool will do this reconnaissance process for you. Like if you have to check your target host is alive or not, all you have to do is copy the IP address and paste in that online tool and hit enter. What will happen is that tool will send a packet to the target system, and if the target system sends back the reply, then it could be considered as active. Sorry, it could be considered that the host is alive. So in that case, your IP address won't be listed in the logs of the target computer. So by this passive reconnaissance, you stay anonymous. There is no direct contact established between you and the target system. So that's why it's called passive. And the next phase is scanning. So in reconnaissance phase, we'll be having so much of information, like what are all the ports, and what are all the services, that will come in scanning. In reconnaissance, we'll have what are all the DNS names and what are all the where the network is, geographical location of the network, and using open source intelligence, we can get so much of details about the particular target. So that's what we'll do in reconnaissance. And the next part is scanning, where we will conduct port scan. This is the phase where we will scanning. You have to make a direct contact with the target when it comes to scanning. So you can perform port scan, that is scanning what are all the open ports available in the target system. So in order to hack into a system, you must have some kind of port through which you can establish the connection. For example, it could be a HTTP port. Like if the target is a web server and it is running some kind of web application, then obviously the port 80 must be open. So what you can do is, you as an attacker can abuse the port 80 or abuse the application that is running on port 80, and you can hack the target system via that port. So that's what we'll do in scanning phase. So in scanning phase, we will scan for vulnerabilities in the application, and we will also generate a network map to get an idea about what are all the IDS, or whether the network has any IDS or firewall, any intrusion detection systems deployed or not. So we'll get an idea about that in scanning phase. And the third phase is the exploitation phase, where you will be hacking into the system directly. So with the information gathered from first two phases, in reconnaissance, we will have so much of information, and in scanning phase, we will have plenty of information that is enough to get into the system. And in the exploitation phase, you'll be getting into the system by launching exploits. And after getting access, so once you launch the exploit, you'll get the access, that is a reverse shell or a command line interface where you can execute commands in the target system. So you'll get such command line. And the next phase is privilege escalation. So after getting such a reverse shell, what you will do is, you will escalate your privilege from a normal user to a high-end user. For example, let's consider a scenario where you have hacked into the target by abusing a web application that is being run on port 80. So what will, in most of the cases, let's consider this as the target system is running a Linux server. In most of the cases, what will happen is, all these Linux server will run this web application as a low privileged user. All right. So what will happen is, even if you hack into the system, you will be provided with only the least privileges, not the admin privileges. That is for every, yeah, that is for every operating system. We have a normal user and admin user. Even in Windows, we have something called NT authority, that is administrator, who has all the permissions, and we have normal users who have the least permission. And even in Linux, we have normal users, and the super privileged user is called super user or root. So root is the most high privileged user in Linux based systems. So what you will after getting access into the system, you will be provided with low privileges. So you as an attacker have to figure out a way to escalate your privileges from low level user to the root or the administrator, depending upon the system which you have, depending upon the target OS. And finally, we have the reporting process where we have to write a detailed report on all these phases, like how you performed reconnaissance, what are all the data that you are able to pull off from this reconnaissance phase, and how you perform scanning, and what are all the data you have gathered from scanning phase, and how you have hacked into the system, and how you have escalated your privileges from low level user to high level user. You have to take screenshots and list all this in a detailed reports. That is what penetration testing report is. I guess that's it. Yeah. So getting into application security, all right, we have time. Yeah. So there are further few types of application security. The famous types is web and cloud. Like plenty of so much of researchers who are getting into this information security will mostly focus on web and cloud because it's easy to get started with. It's beginner friendly. You can get started within like 2 months. Like for getting basic idea about web and cloud security, you can not about cloud security, for web security you can get started like if you dedicatedly work for 2 months, you can get started with it. In web application, in web and cloud security, we will be dealing with the security that is related to web applications, that is website, both static and dynamic websites, and APIs, and cloud security policies. And we have mobile application security, where we'll be dealing with the applications that is being run on mobile platforms, Android, iOS, or any other platforms. Uh, and we have thick and thin client application security. That is, thick and thin client refers to the softwares that you use on your computers, right? You use several computers, right? For even games, they can also come under a thick client. So those standalone applications of your operating system can be considered as a thick client and thin client, depending upon the size of the file, and depending upon the functioning, it can be classified into thick and thin client. And finally, we have embedded applications. Embedded application security is like, for IoT, you have several other applications, right? For Raspberry, you have Raspbian OS and stuff, right? So whatever the security that is being dealt with IoT applications will come under IoT application security, right? So today, in order to give you a basics of security, application security, I'll be speaking about web application security, since my area of expertise is web application. And yeah, to give you a basic knowledge about how a web application works. Okay, so this is your browser. So you are the client, and this is your browser. So for every website you visit, for every website you enter, for example, in your browser you have an URL bar, and you have to enter the target address. So once you hit www.google.com and hit enter, a HTTP request will be sent from the client to the server, right? So for example, if you hit google.com, a HTTP request will be sent to google.com. So this is the Google server, which is residing in Mumbai or in California, depending upon where you are accessing it from. So, well, actually, in the middle, we have so much of process. That is, we have DNS, load balancer, proxies, and so much of stuff going on in the middle. But to give you an overview, what will happen is, once you hit www.google.com in your browser, it will send a HTTP request to the Google server, and the Google server will send a HTTP response. So the basic function of a browser is to send HTTP request and to receive HTTP response. That's the basic function of a browser. Well, the problem is, this HTTP request is not simple like you think. It has so much of complicated things called headers and values. So this HTTP request, I'm not sure if, yeah, I'll show you in upcoming practicals. But in a HTTP request, you will have headers and values, and that is what makes the server to distinguish where the request is coming from and stuff. So all these values will be considered in the HTTP request, and the HTTP response will contain the HTML code. So the HTML response, which will be then rendered by the browser. Okay. So the basic function of your browser is to send HTTP request and receive HTML response from the server, and to render it beautifully, because if the server will just send the HTML code and you won't be able to just read the HTML code, right? You have to visually see the HTML code, and that is the function of the browser. The browser will render the HTML code and it will show you in an elegant way. So that's what the client server model is. And then we have something called Burp Suite, which is the most famous web application penetration testing tool. So Burp Suite will act as a proxy in the middle, right? You know what proxy is, right? Instead of you, some other computer will perform the request and response. So that's what called as proxy. And the same way Burp Suite will work. So what Burp Suite will do is, instead of directly sending the HTTP response to the request to the server and receiving the HTTP response, what it will do is it will act as a proxy. And once the HTTP request leaves the browser, the HTTP request will be captured by the Burp Suite. And in Burp Suite, you can inspect all the requests that are leaving from your computer to the server. So you can tamper the request, you can perform several security tests in the HTTP request, and then you can forward it if you like, or you can also drop the request from your computer. So that's what Burp Suite basically does. And yeah, that's pretty much vague introduction about Burp Suite. And yeah, let's see how you can configure Burp Suite. Let me get into my Kali machine. Okay. Yeah, this is my Kali Linux machine. You have a Burp Suite pre-installed. There are two types of Burp Suite, two versions of Burp Suite. One is professional. The community professional costs you about I'm not sure. You can check out. So Burp comes pre-installed in Kali Linux. All you have to open this, and you will be provided with a dashboard like this. You have plenty of options here, as you can see. In order to first configure this Burp Suite to work with your browser, all you have to do is you have to head to the proxy section, and you have to head to the options section. There you can see that the tick mark, right? And it is pointing to an IP address 127, that is your local host, and 8080. So what it means is that now Burp Suite is running as a proxy in this particular port in your computer, in this particular port. So Burp Suite is running in this port 8080. Now, in order to merge the Burp Suite with your browser, you have to export a certificate. So you have this option called import export, and you have to choose a certificate in DAR format, and you have to select a file. So cert.dar, and save it and give next, and that's it. The certificate is exported. So now if you head to desktop, you can see the certificate here, cert.dar. Right now what you have to do is you have to head to the browser, and you have to open preferences and type in certificates and hit view certificates, and in authorities you have to import the certificates which you have generated. So you have to choose the certificate, double click on it, and trust this click on trust this CA to identify, and trust the CA to identify email users, and hit OK, and that's it. So the certificate is imported. Now what you have to do is you have to download a plugin called Foxy Proxy. So Foxy Proxy is available for all the browsers, I guess. Oh, sorry. And it is working. Yeah. So you can visit to the browser store of Mozilla, and you can add it. So I have this proxy installed already. So if you see, I have this in my Windows, and I have this in my Kali Linux too. Right. So this is the Foxy Proxy I've been talking about. So in order to configure the Burp to be working with your browser, you have to add a proxy. So you have to open this Foxy Proxy, and you have to click on options and hit add. I have already added. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this. Yeah. So what you have to do is you have to click add, and you have to give a name, and go to the IP address and hit your local host IP address, and the port where the burp suite is running on. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So the burp proxy is created. So you can easily switch between proxies. So if you want to use burp, all you have to do is just click on burp. That's it. So now every request that is being sent from your browser to the server will be intercepted by this burp suite. Yeah. So in order to intercept the traffic, you have something called the intercept here. So from this intercept, you can intercept all the HTTP requests. For example, let's say if I hit request, a HTTP request will be sent from my browser to this particular IP address. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to intercept this request. Let's see how I can do. First, you have to choose the burp as a proxy, and you have to click intercept on and hit refresh. Now you see I have, you can zoom it. I have captured the request. So this is how a HTTP request will look like. And let me send it to repeater. So a repeater is a place where you can repeatedly send HTTP request for n number of times. So once you click send, you can see HTTP response, right? So this is response and this is HTTP request. So this is what basically a browser does. It will send HTTP request and it will get HTTP response. Follow redirection, I will get the HTML response. All right. So now we have got the HTML request for the for HTML response for the request that is sent. So what the browser will do is, instead of displaying it as a HTML code, it will render it and it will show it as a login page. So as you can see, it will show it as such beautiful page. So that is what basically browser does. But on the back end of the browser, this is how the browser will work. It will send a HTTP request. This is the HTTP request. It will send it to the target, that is 192.168.0.104, and it will get the HTML response and it will show it as a beautiful page. So now if you have to look at the source code that is being sent from the server, you have to click on view source. Not sure why it's working now. Oh, okay. Yeah, you have to click on view source, and now the view source has been, now you can see all the HTML code coming from the server, right? So that's what basically browser does. So instead of showing you at it as a vague code, it will render it and it will show you beautifully. That's what pretty much browsers does. And that is the use of burp suite. So for every request that is going from browser to the server, you can manually intercept and you can now change the values. You can change where the request is headed to. In this case, now the request is a get request that is being headed to login.php endpoint. So what you can do is you can pretty much change it to restart.php or anything. You can tamper the HTTP request that is sent to the server. Whereas in normal browser, you won't be able to do it, but burp suite allows you to tamper the request. So that's what, that is why people use burp suite. Yeah, right. Okay, so let's get back. I guess now you have an idea of how to configure burp suite. What's the time now? We have 10 minutes left. Yeah, so let's get back to OWASP top 10. So as I've already mentioned, for every year we will release top 10 categories of vulnerabilities that is being exploited in the wild, like the most famous exploited vulnerabilities or the most prevalently existing vulnerabilities. So among this top 10, I have selected few common vulnerabilities or the beginner friendly vulnerabilities, I would say. So the first vulnerability is A1. Okay, so OWASP will classify vulnerabilities ranging from A1 to A10. So the A1 is the highest severe vulnerabilities or the most prevalently available vulnerabilities, and A10 is the A10 is also a vulnerability, but it's low severity vulnerability. So A1 injection, in A1 injection, we have SQL injection, NoSQL injection, LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol, and OS injection. So what all these injection means is that you might have heard about what SQL is. It's a backend programming language. So you will store data into that, and in order to retrieve the data, you will construct SQL queries, right? So let's consider a PHP application. So a PHP application will allow you to communicate front end and back end. That is, front end might be of HTML, Bootstrap, or whatever, and in the back end you have SQL. A PHP or it will be acting as a middleware, and it will merge this front end and the back end. So PHP is the language which will execute, which will construct these SQL queries. So what I'm going to do is, I am as an attacker will construct malicious queries and inject it in some kind of input box that the web application has. For example, if the application has a login form, it is an input box, right? So once I fill the login form, Adityan and any other username and password, and I hit enter, this username and password will be sent to the database, and the database will check. That is, the PHP will check whether the data in the database exists. That is, whether the data that I have entered exists in the database or not. So while checking, I can insert some malicious SQL queries, and I could fetch all the data from the database. So that's what SQL, NoSQL, LDAP, all these injection mean. And we have sensitive data exposure, where the developers will unknowingly expose data. That is, for example, instead of showing, you might have come across, mostly you might have known about what 404 error is. A 404 will arise if something is not found, right? If the requested resource is not found, you will get a 404 error. But when application are poorly configured, or the server is poorly configured, what the application will do is, it will throw an error, but with so much of sensitive data. That is, it will display where the application is hosted, it will display the path of the application, and so much of sensitive data. So that's what sensitive data exposure is, where the sensitive data will be exposed unknowingly by the developers itself, and all the sensitive data will later help the attacker to get into the system. And we have a broken access control, where the unauthorized or low privileged user will have access to modify the data. For example, let's consider WhatsApp. There you have groups, and we have the concept of group admin. So group admin is the only user who can add other users, right? So he has the admin privileges, and only he can add. But by some means, by abusing some flaws in WhatsApp, if you are able to add someone into the group without you being the admin, without you having the admin privileges, then it is called broken access control. It will arise when the low privileged users can unauthorizedly or illegitimately perform some modification which they are not supposed to do. That will come under broken access control. And we have cross-site scripting, which is the most prevalent, I would say. Like every researcher getting into the field will get started with what cross-site scripting is. So basically what cross-site scripting is, when an app executes an untrusted input that will lead to hijacking of user sessions. And I'll show you what a cross-site scripting is. And we have components with known vulnerabilities. That is, for example, if you are using a software, or if let's say you are building a web application, and you are adding a plugin. It could be a WordPress, or it could be a simple library. It could be anything. So what will happen is, if you add some libraries, add some third-party code into your existing code, there is a risk of your application getting hacked, because the third-party code which you are embedding into your system might have several vulnerabilities. So by abusing those vulnerabilities, an attacker could get into your application. So that's what application with known vulnerabilities will come under. And yeah, let's see about what cross-site scripting is. So the impact of cross-site scripting is, it will allow the attacker to execute remote commands in the target's browser. So because cross-site scripting is leveraged by inputting JavaScript into the browser. So you all guys know why JavaScript is used. It is used to interact with the client. So it can execute client-side commands. That's why JavaScript is used. And by abusing this functionality, cross-site scripting will allow the attacker to control the target's browser. So we have three types. For basics, we have two types: reflected and stored. So in reflected, it's a temporary issue. Like only if you visit a particular endpoint, you will be vulnerable for that. Whereas in stored, the issue is permanent. I'll be describing about these two types. And in order to mitigate the cross-site scripting, we have several types of HTML escaping, encoding characters. There are so much. But in general, in context, all you have to do is you have to sanitize the input that is being provided to the server, that is being sent to the server. You have to perform input sanitization by HTML escaping, or whatever the technique you know. So yeah, let's see about what cross-site scripting is. So I have this application which is DVWA, damn vulnerable web application. It's constructed as a deliberately vulnerable web application. So I'll enter the password, which is username is admin and password is password by default. So this is this particular application is deliberately vulnerable, and you can you can use this for practice. So I have this XSS reflected here. So what I'm going to do is consider a scenario where you have an input box like this. So what you can do is, let's say I'll type my name. Yeah, it's printing Aditya. So if I type my name, or if I give some input and click on submit, it displays the input, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to execute JavaScript inside it. So in order to execute JavaScript in HTML, we have something called script tag. Okay, this script tag is basically used to execute JavaScript inside the HTML. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to check whether I can be able to execute JavaScript inside this. So I'm going to I'm going to alert something to check. Okay, alert document.cookie. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Yeah, so now as you can see, we have got an alert that displays our cookie. So document.cookie will actually fetch your cookie and display it. So as you can see, now we were able to alert a pop-up, which means I can execute JavaScripts inside this. So not only I can print names, I can also execute JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to abuse this flaw. So for those people who don't know what cookies is, as you can see, I have logged in, right? So let's say before logged in, I have two cookies, which is 6B404, and security is set to low. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in. So after I log in, the cookies. So you see the cookies will be changed. Okay, so this cookie will differentiate the user. This cookie will differentiate each and every user. For example, if you log in, your cookie will be different and my cookie will be different. So that's how the cookies will perform session management. So yeah, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to steal this person's cookie. So in order to do that, I'm going to construct a payload. So I'll show you how you can construct a payload. So first I'll generate a PHP script, which I've already done. I have a PHP script. I'm not sure if you are able to see. So if you can see what I've done is I've constructed a PHP script that will first redirect the attacker, so redirect the victim to google.com, and also it has something called get request. It has this get parameter, C parameter. So you must obviously have to understand PHP in order to know what I'm doing here. I have defined a get parameter that is named as C, and whatever the data that is being sent to this get parameter will be stored in this cookie variable. And then I am opening a file called log.txt with write permissions, with appending permissions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the cookie into this log.txt file. So the cookie will be get in this C parameter. So right, that's what this PHP script is about. So this PHP script will allow us to fetch the cookie and write it into this log.txt file. So what we are going to do is we are going to abuse the XSS vulnerability here in this application, and we are going to steal this admin user's cookie, and we are going to log in without the password. So I'll show you how to do that. As I've already told, we now have the access to execute JavaScript. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to construct a payload that will redirect the user to document.location. It's equal to HTTP 127.1.8080. Sorry, 8080 is not, it's Burp suit is running there. Stealer.php !C equal to, and I'm going to append the cookie, document.cookie, right? So in order to show you the payload, what I've done is, sorry, right? So I have constructed a payload like this. So this is the payload which I have constructed. I have constructed this script tag, which is to execute the JavaScript that is inside the script tag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to redirect the user to this particular URL, HTTP 127.1. Well, 127.1 is a shortcut for localhost, and I'm going to redirect the user to this stealer.php site, and I'm going to fetch the user cookie there, and I will be sending it to the stealer.php file. And in stealer.php, I'll be redirecting the users to google.com so that the people won't even notice, right? All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this PHP script in port 8000. All right. So now the stealer.php started running. What I'm going to do is yeah, I'm going to visit the URL shortener. Seems the internet is not working. All right. So yeah, well, what I'm going to do is I have crafted the URL like this, and I can either short this URL or by using URL shortener or whatever. So once the victim visits this URL, his cookies will be sent to my stealer.php, which is residing here. So once the user visits here, I guess the code is not running now. Yeah, so as you can see here, we have got the cookie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the cookie. It's in the file called log.txt. So yeah, sorry, I have run twice, so I've got 2 cookies. Sorry, I've got 3 cookies. All right, so now as you can see, we have stolen the cookie of the admin user. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to replicate the session of this admin user. So let's go to a private tab and let's visit this URL called 192.168.0.104 and dvwa. Now, since let's consider I don't know the username and password. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste the cookie which I have stolen here. That is, it's 64B015. So I'm going to paste the cookie here and save the cookie and refresh and visit dvwa. And now you see we have logged into the username admin without knowing the password. So that is how you perform cookie stealing with XSS. As you can see, what we have done basically is we have found an input place where you can execute JavaScript, and you have constructed a malicious JavaScript which will fetch cookies from the target site. And after fetching the cookies, I now have the logs of all the cookies. Using these cookies, I can log into another users without username and password. So that's what cookie stealing is, and this is how XSS works. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't think we have any more time. I'll try to wind it up as soon as possible. Yeah. So before getting into application security, what you have to do is try building before you break into applications, right? So in order to break into applications, first you have to know how the application is built. So without knowing PHP or without knowing, if you are trying to break into a Python application, you must know Python, right? So only then you can understand the vulnerabilities, like how you are exploiting the vulnerabilities and stuff. Or there is another way, you can just mug up those vulnerabilities, like you can watch YouTube videos and directly replicate those vulnerabilities without trying to understand what actually happening back in the back of the vulnerability, how the vulnerability arises and how you can fix this. So only if you understand all these stuffs, you can be able to mitigate against the vulnerability and you can enhance your research. So as a personal advice, I would say is try to build applications. So once you know the building process, then it will be easy if you begin researching how to break the application. So that's why I don't usually break. I build as well as break. So I perform both, and it helps me a lot to understand how the breaking process works. So that's my personal advice. It's not mandatory. And yeah, my personal key to success is you need to have four important aspects. First is passion. Like you should have a never-ending passion in information security. At times you will feel bored, but during those times you could take break. But you should always have interest. Interest is what makes into every field. So I guess that's common for every field. But persistence is something which is definitely important for this field, because if you leave, let's say you are working as a security engineer and you take rest for 10 days, within those 10 days a new vulnerability might have emerged, like zero logon, which is a new vulnerability that has emerged in recent weeks. Like if you take rest for 10 days, multiple new vulnerabilities might have come into the industries by then. So because you need persistence, you have to keep researching until you reach a point where you can teach. So until that point you need definite persistence. Even after reaching the point where you can teach, you need persistence, because in as far as I'm concerned, in information security, what they respect is your knowledge and not your age, right? And yeah, dedication is, this is also common for every field. So just 6 months of hard work, like dedicated hard work, will put you 5 years ahead in your life. Okay, so that's pretty much important for every field. And yeah, research, you can get started with research. Like you can read write-ups. There are several write-ups in Medium, in GitHub, in Gitbooks, everywhere you have plenty of write-ups. You can make use of that, and you can join any communities. Like there are several communities out there. Even you can join Discord channels. Like for OACP preparation, you have several Discord channels. For CH preparation, you have several Discord channels. HTB has, Hack the Box has several Discord channels. Hack the Box has only one Discord channel anyways. So you can join those communities and you can learn from them. And Twitter is the most important source. There, almost all the security researchers are there, and they'll share their instant write-ups there. They will share their instant methodologies. So make use of Twitter. And even YouTube. YouTube is an emerging platform for now. Like everyone is moving to YouTube now. So YouTube also has a lot of resource stuffs. And yeah, don't blame that you don't know where to get started with, and don't blame there is no resources. Knowledge is free, like Anonymous said. Internet is full of resources. You have everything for free. You don't have to, like, this session is literally free. So you have every session for free. And there are a lot of conferences going on. By this time I'm speaking, there are a lot of information security conferences going on that is happening for free. And you have dozens of millions of videos, lectures that is in YouTube for free, and almost all the articles are for free. So there are plenty of resources. All you have to do is the starting point. You get started with application security, I would suggest, because that's beginner friendly. So yeah, knowledge is free. You don't have to pay to anything. You don't have to pay for CEH training. You don't have to pay for penetration testing training. No, don't pay for anything. If you have to take exams, then pay. But before reaching the point, you have to read a lot of resources. You have to read a lot of you have to keep researching persistently. So don't pay anything unless you really need that. Like from my personal experience, I never spent a penny, not even a penny, for researching, for reading. I never enrolled in a course. I never spent a single rupee for learning ethical hacking and stuff. I just completely learned in Google, YouTube and stuff. So I just kept on reading all the articles. That's it. And yeah, this is my personal learning path for application security. First, you start learning from fundamentals, like learn how the networking, like if you don't know what I've been speaking all this time, like the ports and stuffs, then you have to get started with networking, and then learn how web applications work and what are all the headers and stuffs and the testing methodologies. And in research, you have to learn further about how you can perform security tests and read several attack POCs. So for every time a security researcher find a bug, he will publish something called proof of concept, where he will be describing, like I told you, the fifth phase in penetration testing, right? The reporting phase. So all these reports are available in internet for free, the proof of concepts, where an attacker will be mentioning how he hacked into an application. So by reading that, you will get an idea of how to hack into an application. So I guess attack POCs are important, and read write-ups, several write-ups, and if you want to practice, then you can try these free platforms. All these are free and they have subscription based also, but I would prefer, being free is enough. Hack the Box, you can try Hack the Box and try Hack Me, and Vulnum is entirely free. You can download all the vulnerable machines and you can practice it there. And finally, after doing all these, like if you are familiar with all these stuffs, then you can finally test your skills by taking, like, CH practice is not mandatory. You can directly go to OSCP, but in order to gain some confidence for OSCP, or in order to accomplish something before taking OSCP, I would suggest CH practicals. It's too easy. It's pretty much vague, very easy, but it gives you something, right? CH practicals will give you something. So I would suggest CH practicals too, and then OSCP. OSCP is a mandatory one for now. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can ask now, and yeah, you can contact me in the social media. You can shoot your queries to my mail too. That's it. Thank you.
So
Right, if you have any queries.
So
Thank you, Abhishek.
Someone was asking about will you be providing the slide?
Yeah, I'll be providing the slides. How to prepare for OSCP. So I guess I have answered the question. You just keep practicing on Hack the Box machines and Vulnerable machines. Well, even now I am preparing for OSCP, and that's how I'm preparing for OSCP, by practicing in Hack the Box, Try Hack Me, and Vuln Hub machines. And yeah, you'll get slide decks. I guess that's it. Fine, Abhishek. So let's end the meet, right?
Yes. Okay.
I'll send you the slides. I'll mail you the slides.
Yes. Yeah. So I hope everyone would have got some idea about application security. And thank you, Adityan, for accepting my invite. So thank you, guys. So if you don't mind, shall we take a screenshot? Can you all turn up your video? Sai? Sai, are you done?
So is it done?
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, it's done.
Bye, guys.
Okay, thank you. Bye, bro. Yeah.